All right. So warm welcome, everybody. Welcome to the first session of the Leave No One Behind Brownback sessions. It's the #1 brain foods supplier for your lunch break, in which we focus on inclusive and innovative solutions for social justice. My name is Gigi Pascal-Ngalok. I am a full-time activist and social innovator who also happens to work for the Partos Innovation Hub. And as I believe that many of you are attending a Partos event for the first time, I'll share a little bit more about who we are before we move in the actual content. So Partos is the Dutch Trade Association for Development Cooperation, and unites more than 100 Dutch organizations, social movements, academia, and global partners. And through our innovation hub, we provide a learning and an innovation space to help organizations to accelerate their impact for a more equitable and inclusive world. We do this through several topics and activities, working themes such as decolonization and shifting power, data and digitalization, anti-racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion, or inclusive communication. So many different activities, and we do invite you to continue following us. But in the next 14 minutes, we will focus and have a deep dive into participatory grant making with two main questions. So the first is, what are the different approaches to participatory grant making? And secondly, what steps can you take as an organization to actually start integrating and introducing participatory grant making in your organization? So participatory grant making shifts decision-making power about grants from donors, so those who hold the money, to the communities, those who benefit from funding and are at the forefront of change. And this both ensures that funding goes where it's most needed, but also ensures justice and mutual accountability. There are many approaches to participatory grant making, and each with their own methods, challenges, and opportunities. And in this session, we will dive deeper into very, I think, inspiring examples of how organizations try to implement that in their own context. And that might be entirely integrating that in the way that you work. So basically walking the talk through every different levels of your organization, or piloting it at a very, exploratory level. And that will be all covered and explored in this session. We will have, 14 minutes is the aim. We'll see if we can fit it in, but perhaps we'll move a little bit out of our planning. But I will now move on to the host of the session, which is Samuel Matsikure from AIDS Funds. And he will take over the whole presentation and guidance with the rest of the speakers that are lined up today. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to you.
Good afternoon, wherever you are, or good morning or good evening, depending where you're located. We've got an interesting panelist today. That'll be exploring what is participatory grant making. But I'm sure we would also like to hear from you, our audience, what you also think about this. This is an area that I'm very passionate about. I'm a human rights activist, but also a team lead in the International Department for the Key Populations from AIDS Funds. So welcome. And before we kickstart our discussion, I would like to bring in a few questions. What is participatory grant making? So we would like to hear some of your responses also in the chat box from our participants. So you can also type in as we dive in. If you can pull up the slide. Yeah, so we've got a few responses that we have from A to D. You can just type in and dive in and let us know what you think. But I would also like to hear from our panelists who perhaps can introduce themselves as they come in. I have Olga, if you can introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Olga Rychkova, and I'm a senior program officer with the Robert Carr Fund, where I focus a lot on monitoring and evaluation and supporting our funding partners. But RCF is a participatory grant maker from day one, and I'm very much looking forward to sharing some of our experiences with you today.
And Coco, you can also come in. It would be nice to also know what pronouns you use in your daily life. It's important.
Oh, apologies. I'm using she, they.
Thank you.
Thank you, Samuel. My name is Coco Jervis. I also use she, they pronouns. I am the director of programs at Mama Cash. And for those of you who don't know, Mama Cash is the first international women's fund. It was started about 40 years ago by a group of feminist lesbian activists, one of whom received unexpectedly a huge inheritance in Amsterdam, Netherlands, and they decided to use the funding to develop a women's fund. I joined Mama Cash about 3.5 years ago, and when I joined, Mama Cash was not a fully participatory grant maker, but in the course of the last couple of years, we've become a fully participatory grant maker, and so I'm here to talk about some of our experiences transitioning into participatory grant making. Thank you.
Ashley, you can come through.
Thank you. My name is Ashley van Dam. I'm working at Wilde Ganzen Foundation as a project officer. And I'm also coordinating our quite new, I would say, community or participatory grant making program. We piloted it last year and we are continuing it this year. So we are all quite new, but we have some experiences to share today.
Thank you very much. We've got quite a diverse of approaches that we are using in our program when it comes to participatory grant making. And from our panelists, what is participatory grant making from your own perspective and experience? I can start with Coco.
Yeah, so there are actually many different definitions and approaches to participatory grant making. But for us at Mama Cash, we see it as a practice of ceding grant making power to the affected community members and constituencies. So we would put it at B in this called quiz, but it's very open to interpretation. So for us, another way to put it is that participatory grant making is all about sharing power. That's the frame that we have been using. It turns the traditional approaches to philanthropy on its head by recognizing that communities are the experts in their own realities. And we at Mama Cash have long worked from the perspective of a commitment to forging very strong relationships with our grantee partners and sharing not only trust, but transparency and accountability in the process. So for us, becoming a participatory grant making has enabled us to embed really these values into the grant making work. But also I want to say that participatory grant making is also about challenging hierarchies that enable inequality and oppression. So instead of us as a funder deciding what the problem is or what the solution is, we're now creating space for those affected by injustice and equality to make the decisions about how the movement priorities are and where the money should be spent. So I think that through this process for us, it's about transparency and accountability and putting movements right in the driver's seat.
Thanks for that. And Olga, take us through what RCF is using.
Thank you. It was really inspiring to hear from Coco that Mama Cash moved from being a non-participatory to being fully participatory in such a short term. Kudos to that. Robert Carr Fund, being participatory is in Robert Carr Fund's DNA. We were established as a participatory fund from the very beginning. So it is a bit of a different journey. So we essentially had to learn all our lessons as we were establishing and developing the fund. But RCF origin story is that civil society members and funders came together at a decision-making table and agreed to establish a fund to address a critical gap in funding for civil society and community networks in the HIV response. This conversation happened back in 2010 at the ACE conference in Vienna, for those who've been there. And at the time, many civil society and community networks who played a critical role in HIV response, you're probably all familiar with Nothing About Us Without Us, were essentially saying that a lot of funding that's available is short-term, project-based, and really at the disposal of donors, their priorities that sometimes shift and changed. And it leaves many of us really at the point of going bankrupt and going out of business and going out of this activist work. But our lives are truly on the line in it. And together at this table where civil society members and donors came together, it was decided that this fund is needed. And the civil society members were very clear. What we need is long-term, core, and flexible funding. And this initial power sharing resulted in the funding model that RCF pursues till this day. And it's really the voices of those community members at that table is the reason why RCF really prioritizes and provides long-term, core, and flexible funding. Over our 2022 data shows, and we show consistently that this model works really well. It sends the funding where it really needs. And our own data shows that over 88%, so pretty much everyone of RCF grantees rely on core funding to implement their programmatic work, to achieve their, programmatic results and make change happen for their communities and the HIV response. So what we have learned is that, so I share a lot what Coco was saying is about transparency and about accountability and also legitimacy on the fund, but also what we have learned is also it makes this work so much more effective because it sends the funding where it can make the greatest impact.
Thanks for that. Esley, come through.
Thank you. Yeah, it's nice to hear from all these very experienced organizations who have been doing this for so long. I'm a bit jealous, Olga, that you started like this from the beginning. For us as Wilde Ganzen, we are really focusing more and more on community participation. We find it very important in our projects. And then I think participatory grantmaking is a very logic next step to take. And when I get this kind of questions, the first thing that comes to my mind is one of the organizations with who we are doing this in Ethiopia. He was telling me, community problems need community solutions. Who am I in my office in Addis, or even me personally in Amersfoort in the Netherlands, knowing what the communities in Ethiopia need? So if we can really involve community members, they can come up with their own solutions. They are capable of doing that. So I think for me, that's really a motivation to work in these systems, because it's not always easy, but I think it's very rewarding. So I'm very happy that Wilde Ganzen is taking this initiative also to more and more work with participatory grantmaking.
And just to take us through, what are some of the things that we should expect when implementing participatory grantmaking, and what are the outcomes of that? Coco, you can come through.
Sure. So before Mama Cash transitioned into a fully participatory grant maker, we spent about 2.5 years researching, information gathering, consulting, and facilitating dialogues and decision making about the transition. We spoke with other participatory funders like RCNF to seek their input and advice and collect feedback. And we had extensive dialogues with our advisors institutionally as well, internal stakeholder and external stakeholders, our board, in particular, our grantee partners. And our aim was to make the research and design process reflective of our participatory ethos and to lessen the extractive nature of collecting information. So in the end, we really were very diligent about sharing back what we have learned, and all of the learnings that we incorporated, we also were very cognizant of uplifting the organizations and individuals that really supported us through that. So we also spent a lot of time having internal conversations and deliberations to ensure that the values of power sharing and transparency was embedded all across how Mama Cash worked. We had to weigh the assorted risks of due diligence, risk auditing, how to deal with restricted funding, financial reporting, donor management, that was a big thing, and amongst other issues. So a couple of the lessons that we learned just on the top level, we didn't have to recreate the wheel. As I mentioned before, we learned from a very diverse set of community practitioners, of community participatory grant makers from around the world. There's a really great community practice available out there, and you can really learn from them and grow in this process. It's a co-creating process with community, so there's a lot to learn. We started small and built up. We started our transition with a multi-step effort with one small fund, and then over time we built it up to so that it encompasses all of our grant making. So we wanted to test it out and pilot it, and provide more assurances to our stakeholders that this is really the approach that they should invest in. And then we really had a lot of conversation, in particular me talking about what we needed to do to increase the risk appetite. We have to be willing to try out new things. And so we were really talking to our decision makers, talking to our donors a lot about it's no small feat within the philanthropic sector to take this step, and that we really needed to invest the time and effort and resources into it. And then finally, we share back what we learn. We continually share back the good, the bad, the messy of our participatory transition, so that we can learn and know that becoming a participatory grantmaking is not an end destination, but it's a process.
Thanks for that. Olga, if you can take the same question again from your experience.
Yes, thank you. And again, I really can relate to so much to what Coco was saying, even though RCF process might have been slightly different, given that we started as a participatory grant maker. But a lot of those lessons, how do you manage, different donor priorities when you're doing the participatory grant making, all is very relevant. But I think what I want to say is that our main lesson is participatory grant making works. It's really kind of having those voices of the communities, of civil societies at the decision-making table really made a difference in how RCF makes funding. And we deliberately speak about sharing power, because it means when both civil society and donors share the table, there's not just power that is being shared, but also knowledge, insights, nuance. And we believe that this process has been useful not just for the fund and where the money goes, but also kind of nurture those relationships on the RCF International Steering Committee and Participatory Advisory Panel, where those decisions are being made. And it's really, as I already said, the RCF model in providing core, long-term and flexible funding is really strongly influenced by having those civil society and community voices in those decisions, and really advising what is the best way to direct the funds, where they can make the greatest impact. And it's the arguments that by investing in strong civil society and community networks, when they have strong organizational homes, that's when they are most likely to also have strong programs and make change happen. And if you think about it, it's logical. If you don't have to worry about your rent, or your office rent, if you don't have to worry about your payroll, that you can hire and retain really strong, experienced advocates and activists in the field, who you can retain for many years, you're most likely to make change happen, because you build kind of this potential, the human potential, as a community network. And so this has kind of been one of the arguments for prioritizing core funding. And RCF sees it really in the results. I think our biggest test has been just a couple of years ago when the COVID-19 pandemic happened. And we really saw that grantees that have been in RCF family for several grant cycles were so well prepared to respond to it. They had the capacity and kind of internal resources to really pivot and address the situation hand-on, even before in some cases governments were prepared to address the needs of their communities in country. So that really speaks to the power of investing in the community systems the way the communities themselves need it. And another point I wanted to make is that participatory grantmaking also depends on good process. There's a lot of process on it. You have to bring many voices to the table, and you may need to make sure that you bring it in a really good way. Having participatory process gives you a lot of legitimacy, gives you a lot of authenticity and credibility in the field, but you also need to be really very careful about how real or perceived conflicts of interest are managed. So it's managed in a very transparent and a very robust way. And so you really, really need to pay attention to those processes. And sometimes it might feel, well, there's so many people involved in making decisions. Is it faster if we just have, I don't know, program officer go and make all those decisions sitting, in Amsterdam? But no, the benefit is not the same. It's really cannot be compared. And that process is really, really worth it because it makes the funding stronger, it makes the community stronger, but it also brings all the additional benefits of relationship building and knowledge sharing on the participatory panels. And lastly, real participation requires enabling. Like you cannot create an equal seat of the table because some people need a little bit extra support in order to be able to participate as equals. And so you as a fund also need to be prepared to do that. Just placing people in the same room and asking the same question does not create equal share of power. Everybody comes to their table with different experiences and knowledges, and that's the wealth and the power of the process. But they also come to the table with different power differentials, and that needs to be addressed. So that needs to be really built into your process. So in a nutshell, it really works, but you really need to be very intentional about your process. You need to be patient with your process, and you also need to really invest in your participatory systems.
So there is a lot to consider in all this. And Esli, from your experience, what other things have you noted?
Yeah, I think there are many things that Coco and Olga said, and I will not repeat them because then I think we will still be here at 4 o'clock. So let's not do that. Yeah. But I think what really struck me when I started working on this is it's all about trust. Trust from us in the communities, trust from the communities in us, but also the communities in the advisory committees, for example. Through participatory grantmaking, we also support informal groups. And I notice also with our partners in Ethiopia or in Tanzania that they're saying, how can we trust them? And even the communities that say, well, how could we ever support the project of the greening and gardening group in this school? But because they involve the community, they call out for community meetings, they really meet with everyone, they can build a trust. And I think that's for me, that's really something that got my attention in this entire process. You need to trust always in all directions. So I think that's an important one for me.
Human relations are critical, and from all you said, communities are at the center of this, and you have to create trust. And for those who might want to consider putting participatory grant making as a model for themselves, what are the steps that they need to take to be able to do this? Coco, you can go ahead and come in.
Well, I want to underscore that doing participatory grant making isn't easy. As I mentioned, we went through a 2-year process. It has required a lot of time, resources, strong leadership, and an internal excavation has been required because at Mama Cash, we had to transition not only our policies, procedures, and practices, but also some of our staffing roles and responsibilities. And we had to become much bolder about testing things as was mentioned, It's so, and I also say building trust-based relationships is a continuous process, both institutionally, but also on the hand of our grantee partners. So I would say that, take it slow, do a lot of research, make sure that the process of becoming a participatory grant maker also involves community, also involves what they think should be the priorities in the process of transitioning. I think that is probably what I would suggest. I would also say that you have to be prepared for the fact that as you transition, it will require a lot more institutionally, but over time, it is because over time you can see the results because for us, our grant making has become much more informed. It has become much more impactful, and we have a stronger, more transparent relationship with community.
And Olga?
I just want to start with a bit of a personal reflection, saying that I came to Robert Carr Fund from a traditional philanthropy, where as a program officer, I would sit in my office and make and I would have as a person a lot of decision-making power, what gets funded and what doesn't. And of course, there are institutional processes in place, but then There's a very strong sense of, as a grant maker, I'm the expert, I have the knowledge and I have the power to send the money in the right direction. And so coming to the participatory grant maker role, I realized that the demands and the role of the same job title as a program officer is radically different. And I think there's also a lot of liberation and joy in it, because you come into those relationships in a completely different way. And that's liberates you from, this heavy burden of making those decisions, but also makes, it helps to kind of, and those decisions are made intimately stronger. So I feel my 2 cents is that my main lesson of being now part of the Participatory Grantmaking Fund for the past 4 years is that the whole is bigger than the sum of the parts. It's not just about the grants that we make, but about the relationships we build, how the knowledge is shared across different parts of the system, between civil society members and the donors, between our technical partners and the staff. It's really invaluable what the different culture shift it generates. But also, you really need to invest in good processes, and not just for the grant making itself. Everything Robert Carr Fund does, we do in a participatory manner, including measuring results. Our MEL framework is quite developed because, of course, there's a lot of questions. What does the core funding deliver? It supports organizations, how it's linked to, change on the ground and programmatic outcomes. And so you really need to think together, okay, how are we going to measure it? And then when you bring your participants, when you bring your grantees and funders and everybody else and making those decisions, it ultimately makes every process stronger and more aligned with the realities on the ground. So I guess my key takeaway when you're developing the steps, don't think about the grant making itself, think about all the other processes that come on board. And in the end, as I said, tapping into collective wisdom has a particular kind of joy that you do not get anywhere else.
And Ashley, you can also add a bit more from your own experience.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I think a lot has been said again already, so I can keep it short. That's nice. Eh? So I think for me, there are 2 things. I think first, it's about acceptance. Acceptance that our role here in the Netherlands or in Europe in general can change. Accept that we can shift the power in this way. I think that's an important one for your internal organization as well. And then I think for me, I would also recommend to really focus on partnerships, but also to look for partners that are really rooted in the communities. For us as Wilde Ganzen, we really work with advisory committees who are really in the villages. So we don't have someone in others deciding what project we will support somewhere 200 kilometers further down the road from others, but really within the communities. And then I'm coming back to my first answer again, because community problems need community solutions. And yeah, I think through participatory grant making, that's something that we can work on all together.
Thanks for that. There is so much that we've had so far. It seems like time was just flying, but at the same time, there's some rich information, I think, as a start that you've provided. And I think just to recap some of the points that I had clearly, and I hope other participants also who are listening have heard what I had as well. It's important that we put communities at the center. And I think we've moved away from traditional way of philanthropy, where communities themselves make decisions and prioritize what works for them and what doesn't work for them. There's a need for power shift that needs to happen. And I think that also comes a lot in the conversations that are also happening globally around what actually decolonization is about. And I think sometimes we can be very uncomfortable when we have to shift our role, but it's a decision that a lot of funders have made if you want to put participatory grant making at the core for organizations, where your previous role as an officer also changes. And you have to let go of certain powers as well. But I think partnership building also came through. We need to build trust. We need to build healthy partnerships where there's accountability, transparency, and also addressing injustice that can actually happen in the process of doing participatory grant making, but also communities being the decision maker. And that comes with some of the funding that sometimes we don't get as programmers or as grantees, especially core funding. And this is an area that a lot of organizations don't get core funding, but they get program funding. So it is important that we also look at the type of funding that is also coming and is being used. And in the process of doing participatory grant making, it's important that you see it not as a beginning and an end, but we need to constantly consult with our communities. We need to look at our power values, but we have to be committed to shift the culture of the organization. And I think process is critical. The way we are going to take the process means we need to consciously change our structure of the organization, how we operate, and also how we use the power that exists by the resources that we hold. There's so much that we need to think about from what we've been given. But I think it's also for people to recognize that there are certain things that we also need to consciously put at the table, the voices of communities, but also recognizing that there are power dynamics and there are group dynamics and individual dynamics that also come into play. There are certain voices that perhaps while they are on the table do not speak out that much. How do you make sure you're accommodating those voices? And I think it's very critical when we think about diversity, not only diversity in our color, in the way we look, but also looking at diversity holistically. How are you bringing in women? How are you bringing people with disability? And all those kind of things are things we need to take into place. But it's also important that we should be prepared to look at time, leadership, commitment, and also building trust with different communities, and also making sure that as decision makers, we are always conscious of the privileges and power that we hold. These are some of the things that I had just coming through, and there's a lot more that we can continue to unpack in the next coming sessions. Hopefully for those that are listening, we hope that you can continue to give us feedback, but we would also like to give you at least a one-pager once we have done with this session, and hopefully there will be other sessions where we can continue to unpack a little bit more. Today was a teaser for you, and I think it's important that we all share the information that we have and the resources. And I would like Gigi to come in and give us a little bit more on what the next steps are.
Thank you, Samuel. Well said. I'm so grateful for the huge amount of knowledge and practice that is shared in just these past 40 minutes. As said before, there is so much that we can still continue talking about. I've seen the chat buzzing with many questions, but also a lot of resources that we could use. Good to know that we are planning to also create a community of practice where we can take these questions to the table and basically discover together how we can start integrating participatory grant making more in our own organizations. And obviously this comes with the challenges, this comes with many questions, and this comes with a very tailored approach to what it means in your organization, but that will be a space for you to discover. We will send an invite for this community of practice by mail in the recap. And as I'm realizing that we have 2 more minutes before the end of the session, I would like to send people off with, the freedom to leave, but I also think that we can use the coming minutes still to answer some of the questions that have been shared. So it's free for you to stick around. But if you need to leave, feel free to do so. And I really thank you for all of the effort, and special thanks to all of the speakers. And then I will hand it over, or I will not hand it over. I might just pick out one of the questions then from the chat. I saw a very interesting one. I think maybe Olga might be able to respond to that, which was around the question of how do we relate scaling? So basically the question of, does PGM, participatory grant making, leads to interventions that are cost effective and scalable? In the context of measuring impacts, how do we go about scaling?
Good question. I don't think it's RCF is in the business of piloting interventions and then scaling them up. I think the whole, if I understand the question correctly, the whole principle of RCF is we fund communities that are already there on the ground. They come to us and tell us what is it that they need. So we do not set the program parameters. We do not tell grantees what to do, essentially. We do make sure that our funding is directed into supports RCF theory of change, which is investing in community, into the network strength, to developing stronger networks as organizations and with stronger influence to do their advocacy. So this is really investing in their systems. That's our outcome area number one. And then we have three programmatic outcome areas, as we call them: human rights, increasing access to services for inadequately served populations in the HIV response, and advocacy for better funding for communities in the HIV response. And as long as grantees come to us and the work they propose fits into these areas, it's up to them what and how and when they want to do it. And the word flexible in RCF funding model is also very important. It allows grantees to come to us when the context changes and they say, well, we received a 3-year grant from you, and when we sent the proposal, we planned to do X. However, since then, the situation has drastically changed. For instance, we all heard about the anti-LGBT laws being passed recently in East Africa, for instance, which dramatically changed context for some of our partners. And so they come to us and they ask if they can use our funding to respond to that situation, which was not in their original plans because that change didn't happen then. And then they can use RCF funding in order to do that. And this is what makes RCF funding more effective because it really allows grantees to do what's needed and what's necessary and can have impact rather than to stick to the original kind of project parameters that have been decided outside of their communities. So we are not about kind of scaling that in that way. The scale of work is really up to grantees themselves. However, what we do, we have a very detailed and developed what we call MEL framework, monitoring, evaluation for learning framework, where we really measure grantees' impact on these 4 outcome areas that I just described, as well as the value of core funding, investing in the community systems. I will actually be speaking at a webinar organized by the Community of Practice of Participatory Grantmakers that Coco also mentioned next week, talking about our participatory approach to exactly that, measuring impact. So if you're interested, please join there as well, so we can talk more about how do we measure impact.
And Gigi, can I just quickly add? And I think that one of the things that we have to remember that when we are talking about participatory grantmaking is that it is about challenging power dynamics. And so we know with a philanthropy that's donor driven that there are so many examples of money being invested into communities from donor driven priorities that are not scalable, that is not meeting what the community demands. And so we have to really think about how, when we're the assumptions that we're making when we are looking at participatory grantmaking through a risk paradigm. And so, and I'm not saying that participatory grantmaking is a magic bullet. It doesn't completely disrupt entrenched power dynamics. But for us at Mama Cash, it's one step in the right direction, one tool that can be used to disrupt power imbalances and really return funding back to the community so they can decide what their own priorities will be and where their investments should go to.
Wonderful. Thanks, Coco, for that addition. Perhaps a final question that I saw from the audience, which was actually about perhaps also challenging the idea that communities would be the best to decide, as like in the end of the decision-making model. With a question of, is there also an example of participatory grant-making where not only communities, but for example, also businesses or governments are included in the decision-making process, which I would say probably would lean more towards multi-stakeholder partnerships. I'm curious if anyone can take on that, or if you have experience with having such a multi-stakeholder composition of decision-making.
Well, maybe what I will say is, I think it depends on your definition of the community. If your community is businesses, then businesses can be involved. If your communities are people on the ground who are affected by a certain issue, then that's the community. However, when we are talking about RCF, we are Robert Carr Fund. We are talking indeed about people, as we define them, who are inadequately served in the HIV response. But our members of the decision-making panels also include, for instance, donors, as well as what we call technical partners, for instance, the Global Fund or UNAIDS. And they all have important things to contribute, and they all share in decision-making within kind of defined governance charter and parameters. So everybody comes there with a specific role. However, when it comes to the actual, sorry, let me correct myself. They all contribute their knowledge and insights in the discussions. However, when it comes to the actual decision-making power and the voting power, it's really equally divided between the donors and civil society members. We have equal number of donor and civil society members who have the voting power in decision-making process. I'm not sure, I don't think it answers your question fully. However, as I said, like, you know, the decision-making power table has different constituents on it. And it's really about how that relationship is set up in the process. And our way to do it is to equally distribute the voting power between the two. But on that end, also, we want to make sure that civil society members are actually empowered to make the decisions and sometimes challenge the donors on the decisions. And we've definitely seen that happen. Sometimes decision was made differently than the original discussion because of civil society insisting on it. But we also do a lot in make sure that the civil society members have what they need to be able to participate in those decisions, recognizing that a lot of donors have with massive institutional support behind them. They're all members of very large institutions, whereas civil society members usually not. And so we are really trying to see like what is your need in knowledge building and your own capacity, and even your ability to travel. So it's really important to be very kind of aware and cognizant and have a space for having those conversations. How does power sharing look for you in your specific context, so that we really create an equal decision-making table.
Thank you so much, Olga. Being mindful of time, I think we're going to wrap up the session. Again, I would like to really thank and express gratitude for the speakers that showed up today, Coco, Olga, Ashley, Samuel, for hosting the session and sharing your reflections in the end as well. We will end the session, and we hope to welcome you at one of our next Brown Bag sessions for other inspiring topics. And obviously, we're also going to continue the conversation around participatory grant making. If you wish to be updated about upcoming events, you can always subscribe to our newsletter and watch our website or social media for, well, new buzzing events. Link is in the chat. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Cheers.
Thank you.